Good morning again. Admiral, thank you so much for joining us. As I was saying earlier, the theme basically of this morning is this idea of leadership and leading through volatile times, which you've had your share of doing over your career. You were the Chief of Defense and Commander of the Netherlands Armed Forces from 2017 to 2021, when you then became, I think as everyone heard, the Chair of the Military Committee of NATO, which is the most senior military officer. And you were that from June 2021 through January 2025. You left that position just days before the new president of the United States took office. Obviously, you were there during the invasion, the most recent invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And now you and your colleague, Eleonora Russell, have written a book which is provocatively titled, If You Want Peace, Prepare for War, a blueprint for deterrence. And as I understand it, when we talked, you've been advising CEOs and businesses and the public generally about how we need to think about approaching these volatile times, because without significant changes in the way that we think about the future and the way we prepare, we in the West leave ourselves quite vulnerable. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Obviously, we have to address the elephant in the room. The two elephants in the room, Greenland, and the President of the United States' fixation on owning Greenland, which is obviously a territory of the Kingdom of Denmark, and which is obviously a key ally and an important member of NATO. So, are we witnessing the destruction of NATO at this point?
No. I think NATO is too important for the U.S. to have it broken up by this. So it is clear for me that Greenland is important for our security. And I think more and more nations understand that. It primarily has to do with the fact that, and that's interesting because climate change is actually the cause of melting of the ice in the Arctic, and therefore the waters in the Arctic become more and more navigable. And that is good news for China because 90% of the volume of everything that is transported across the world is done by merchant vessels, not value, but volume. And so the Chinese benefit from this because the route to Europe and the United States is shortened with about 10 days, which is huge for that. But if merchant vessels can navigate those waters, then naval vessels can navigate them too. And that means that the Russians can bring their Pacific fleet in a much easier and faster way into the North Atlantic Ocean. And unfortunately, we see a very concerning cooperation between China and Russia more and more. China calls itself a near-Arctic state, which actually would mean that the Netherlands, my home country, would be a near-Arctic state. And what is new is that Russia actually allows China in their Arctic, in their part of the Arctic, which has never happened before, that anyone was allowed there for many, and especially strategic reasons. So what you actually see is China keeps Russia in the war in Ukraine. They provide not only political support, because what they said about Greenland now, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China about Greenland, that it's a sovereign state and internationally recognized borders and that the US should respect that. I've never heard that announcement with regard to Ukraine towards Russia. So that is interesting. And secondly, they produce no weapons for Russia as they formally state, but they give Russia every part, all the raw materials to make all the weapons that Russia needs. So actually, indirectly, they give weapons to Russia. Now, for me, it's clear that all of this, what we see happening, is about rebalancing power between the US and China. That's where the turmoil comes from. And I think we will be in this for at least 10 to 15 years, hopefully with as little war as possible. But if tectonic plates shift, then there's earthquakes. And if the tectonic plates of power shift, there's unfortunately crises and wars. And I think that's what we see now. It's not necessarily a World War III, but it can be regional wars, it can be local wars, but it will be volatile for a while until there is a new balance between those two powers. And although people talk about Russia as a world power, only China and the US actually have the economy to reach their ambitions. Of course, Russia has nuclear weapons, and therefore it is an important country where you have to take into account. But so I think this is about China and the US. And I think when you look at Greenland, it is a very important and strategic island, but for NATO, I would say. So NATO can actually help the United States to remain safe. I don't think the US needs to own Greenland for achieving that. Since World War II, there is treaties and agreements with the Kingdom of Denmark to actually work on Greenland, in and around Greenland. The US withdrew from Greenland and left only about 150 military personnel in a base, but is now interested to go back, and that is understandable.
And you agree with that?
And I agree with that, because I'm really concerned about the Russian-Chinese cooperation. This is far beyond Ukraine. This is, as I said, about the Arctic, but it is also about hypersonics. It's about space. It's about raw materials. And so, I mean, China produces about 38% of the world's production. So to be independent from China is impossible by now. And if President Trump, for example, talks about bringing back the automobile industry to the United States, it is actually a discussion of assembly more than of production, because all the parts that are in those cars basically come from China. And there's no nation on earth at the moment who can produce at mass with precision and on time and within the agreed price. So that is an amazing thing. And then when it comes to raw materials, we see an increasing dependency on China, because we were only thinking about efficiency in the West. We were only thinking about getting rich, and nobody was thinking strategically and about effectiveness. And so I think we sold all the mines, and we are now surprised they own them, and that they actually start using it.
And outsource them anyway.
And to actually use it against us.
Right, right. I think that's a good segue into the thinking in your book, which is, again, this idea of preparing for war is how you maintain peace, which, again, I think is a very different perspective than what we've been living through in the last 30 years or so. And is that a lesson that you think our NATO allies and the EU, the rest of the EU, has embraced yet, has learned? Where does that stand? Because that also has been a major complaint of the President of the United States, as well as others, that Europe was not shouldering a sufficient amount of the burden for its own defense.
There's a good number of things that I do not agree with President Trump, but I fully agree with him when it came to NATO and the contribution of the nations other than the US and maybe Poland and the Baltic states at the time. So I think the Americans in general, not MAGA, not Republicans, not President Trump, not the White House, but the Americans in general are sick and tired of Europeans and Canadians that are not taking responsibility for their own security. And I think Europe has had almost free security for 40 years. They had free goods from China and free oil and gas from Russia, and all three is over. And I think that's why in especially Europe, the shock is biggest, because people start to realize it is something we have to work on. And as I said earlier, yesterday, I think there's a lot of people that sort of understand the wake-up call, but too many people are still in bed. And I think they need to come out of bed and start to show results and get into action mode, because there's a lot of talk in Europe, there's not a lot of walk. And so I think that is the change that needs to happen. It will cost money. It will have an impact on other things in our societies. That is a difficult thing for politicians, but that's their job. What I'm trying to do is to convince people that it's not only strong armed forces if you want to deter the Russians, but if you look at hybrid warfare and the things that the Russians have used against Ukraine, they've used energy as a weapon, food as a weapon, migration as a weapon. Of course, there's information as a weapon on a daily basis, cyber warfare. All these things together make it that we have to, as a society, become stronger. And that includes the private sector. It means that for a long time people thought the economy was something in a silo, and there was a security silo, and they were separate. Until very recently, not a lot of business leaders were interested in the security discussion.
Right.
And I think they are waking up to that, and I think it is connected. Security is the cross-cutting theme here, and I think that is something people start to understand now. But it is also all these other areas where you have to become stronger. You have to be able to resist shocks. That's what resilience is about. And if you look at hybrid warfare and the things the Russians have been doing in the last 5 years, this is not only drones over airports, this is arson, this is murder attempts. There was a murder attempt on the CEO of Rheinmetall in the summer of 2024. This is serious business. This is because a defense company is very successful, and that is worrying for the Russians. And so this is all connected to each other, and this is about migration as a weapon. So as a society, we need to understand we need to do more than just spend money on the armed forces. I think we sort of outsourced security to the armed forces. Right. We give you money, but we don't want to be bothered too much with it. And if I ask people, do you want more security in a big room, then most of the people will raise their hand and say, yeah, I want more security. And then I say, can you imagine you will become part of the solution? And then people look shocked at me, because that's where we have the military for. Well, ladies and gentlemen, those professional military soldiers will go to war for all of us. They will, don't you worry. And Article 5 will work. If Estonia is attacked, we will evoke Article 5. That's the question that's probably coming as well. But the problem is of war that after 2 days, soldiers get wounded and soldiers die. And where do you think the new soldiers come from? It is from our societies, because it is our problem. It's not someone else's problem. It is our problem that we as a society have to solve. And I think that realization is that someone else will solve my problem is deeply ingrained by now. The individualism is so deeply ingrained by now. It's about my rights, my privacy. Everything is about me. Whereas a society is not the sum of all the me's. And if I say, people, do you really believe you have privacy? I hope nobody thinks that. Google knows we're all here. Right. And you all gave that away, willingly. But if the government says, can I look in your phone for 10 seconds, there's a revolution. It's ridiculous in a way.
Well, to that end, though, in terms of this whole of society approach, the countries in Europe and the United States, we don't have a command and control economy, not yet anyway, which is something of a disadvantage, against adversaries like China, like Russia, who can organize their economies in ways that make them all on the same path. So how do we tackle that?
Yeah, it is about convincing people. That's why I'm here today. It is about convincing people it's necessary to start to move. Because the hyper-focus on efficiency and accountability for the last 40 years means that we have lost, in certain areas, our effectiveness. And so the just-in-time, just-enough economy that we have created as a result, and it is about maximizing the output of the production system. If you order your car, you will hear it's in the third quarter of 2026 in the color and with the leather seats they will start building it only after you have ordered it. And that's, so all that is enormously efficient, but it's not necessarily effective. As we've seen with the pandemic, we needed more than we could produce, and we now see it in a war where you need more than we can produce. And so this is about ramping up the production capacity in the defense industry. When I started talking in my capacity as the chair of the military committee to the defense industry, it's always someone else's fault. So they started to point at their finger at the financial sector, and they said, we can't get a loan because it's not ethical to invest in defense, or it's against the sustainability goals, or what have you. And so then I started to talk to the pension funds and the banks, and they said, yeah, it's against the sustainability goals. And then I spoke to a CEO of a bank, and I said, I mean, look it up. Is it really a problem? I don't believe it's a real... And he came back to me a week later and said, no, it's not a problem. Actually, there's no regulations that forbid us for doing this. So we will solve this, he said. Well, I said, it will take much longer than you believe, because this is a transformation issue. If you have learned for 40 years to do something in a certain way in an organization, and all the people that work there think about efficiency first and foremost, and the last 20 years they think about sustainability, then it's not a switch. Because the loan of 5 million euros for this startup is not on the desk of the CEO. It's on the desk of a mid-level staffer. And if that person believes it's against the sustainability goals, it ends up on the no stack.
We have, I have, and my colleagues throughout Bloomberg have begun noticing, though, in Europe, this change of definition of sustainability to include the sustainability of democracies, of a way of life. So some of that seems to be getting through at this point.
But it takes much longer than I would like.
Right. Do we have that time?
No, we don't have that time. And the whole thing about a transformation is that it takes a long time. And the only good thing, and really that's the only good thing about a war, is that it helps you focus tremendously. Because in a war, it's only about effectiveness, not about efficiency. And so that is what, and so I hope we can make this change without a war. But if people still think it's a faraway problem, and if people still think it's a choice, and if people think it's still sort of charity resilience, then my message is it isn't. The choice has been made for us by Russia and China. We should be prepared.
And we've seen that focus and the clarity of focus that comes with war in Ukraine, certainly in the way that we now understand and how to fight those wars and what's necessary to fight those wars. But I'm not sure, as you say again, that lesson has been learned by the rest of Europe and the United States, for that matter, the public. So are we at risk of sleepwalking into this into a greater crisis?
In a way we are, because I very often hear, you know, Admiral, the Russian tanks will not roll through the streets of Davos or wherever I am, then that city is named. But again, if you look at what war is, it's not just at the front line. Right. We are, in a way, one could say, sort of at war when it comes to cyber. Yeah. We are at war, sort of. We're in low intensity. In information domain, we are. We are challenged.
And the other acts of sabotage, murder.
And all the other things that is
That's
happening.
all happening at
That
this
is
point.
all happening on a daily basis. I think cyber-wise, companies have started to understand earlier than physical security that was a challenge. And so I think in cyber, we are a little bit better off than in other areas. Right. But there's a lot of things that needs to become more resilient.
You were saying to me earlier, though, that people think, the streets here are safe. My life in Amsterdam is wonderful, Berlin, New York for that matter. But that could change very quickly, no?
Yes. So I explain in a theater performance about the book that if there's a war in Estonia, for example, that it will also lead to huge hybrid attacks, including cyber attacks. For example, if you look at Spain, there was a 24-hour power outage. Enormous chaos. Enormous chaos. In the Netherlands, at any given time, there's 45,000 people in an elevator. So if there's a power outage, these people need to be saved in a way. You can't get to, within 2 hours, there's a battery in your phone that is still full, but the batteries at the masts where the mobile transmitters are is gone. So after 2-3 hours, you don't You can't make a mobile phone call anymore. So how do you reach your people if you want to organize your company? So you can't go to the bank because the bank machines do not work anymore because of the power outage. Then you think, I'll get my car. But other people thought about that as well, and there's no fuel anymore. So how do you reach your parents, and how do you go to your work if there is a crisis? So I say to companies, if you haven't thought about this, you will find yourself in a crisis without any plan. And if you then say as a company, okay, I did a scenario, and as a result, I now have satellite phones, which is a great example of resilience in terms of being able to continue part of the work, to be able to organize yourself. Then it shouldn't be in the box in your office, in the cupboard, because without having been loaded, because then it doesn't work either. So you need to also do some exercising as companies. The CEO at some point should actually say, there's no current, I want to see those phones, and I want you to phone me in 5 minutes or in 2 minutes.
Right.
And if there's no battery charged, then there is a problem for that person. So all these things you have to understand that it's not just thinking about it and the solution, you also have to live through the
Or that someone else will come to the rescue.
And then someone else will come to the rescue, where actually you can only solve your problem.
We don't have much time left, just 30 seconds, but do you see, lost in all of this conversation about Greenland, is Ukraine and what happens about the war, the end of the war? Do you see any end of the war in Ukraine anytime soon?
For me, it's unacceptable if Putin can walk away from this war as the winner. That's one. And I don't see how that is benefiting the US if that is the case. So I don't understand that is beneficial for the US as well. Second, at the moment, I don't think there's any incentive for Putin to end the war. And there's 3 reasons. One, he hasn't reached any of his strategic goals. He doesn't even have the Donbas region. So that's one. Second, he has a war economy that's he's done that quite well. So the Russians are producing more than they need for the war in Ukraine, weapons and ammunition. And so they are reconstituting their armed forces whilst at war. So that's quite an achievement. And that means we have less time to prepare ourselves and to become better, in accordance with all the agreements that the leaders have made in NATO. And thirdly, there are 700,000 soldiers in occupied Ukraine. And many of them are traumatized. If the war ends, they will not get the high pay anymore. A lot of them are partly wounded and have to continue to fight. There's more than 1 million soldiers dead or wounded as a result of this war in Russia alone. So all these soldiers will come back to Russia and will cause a lot of trouble, as the Russian soldiers that came back from Afghanistan in the early 90s. That led to the spike in criminality in Russia. So I think that is the challenge for him. So why would he end the war if it causes only problems for him? So there's no incentives for him. And the one that wants peace is President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people, but it should be a just peace. And that means that it might lead to giving up some territory. I think the Ukrainians, nobody wants that, but they sort of understand it might be part of the outcome, but it cannot be a peace where they are going to be attacked again in 2-3 years' time. Then what have we achieved?
Meanwhile, we're arguing about Greenland. So
Greenland is not going to be militarily attacked. I cannot imagine that is going to happen.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Admiral.
Okay.